but this has been a great conference so far. Everybody's been super excited. I don't think I've ever been at a conference where after the initial introduction of what we're doing, I get so many questions of, great, and how much is it? The problem with what we're doing is, in the mineral space, we're in the business of giving mineral investors an edge. And so what I find is we're a little bit like Fight Club, where the first rule is not to talk about Fight Club. So I'm trying to get those of you out in the audience, there's a bunch of you who are our clients now, and I really encourage you to tell your friends and the people you're running into at the conference about what you're doing with Source Water and Sourcenergy. And I'm going to give you an introduction to that today. Source Water, which many of you have heard of, has been around for a better part of 8 or 9 years. And we're actually now in the process of changing our name to Sourcenergy. And we're doing that because the bulk of our business has actually become energy companies, including mineral investors, not necessarily in the water space. And what we're doing is pioneering energy intelligence with new kinds of technology and data analytics methods. And what we found is that we're able to really change the ground game in mineral investing, particularly with what we're doing with satellite intelligence. And that's what I'm going to focus on today. So what I'm going to talk about is first give you an introduction to ourselves, because of course on every date, like most of you guys, I start the day by talking a lot about myself. And then on the second part, we're going to talk about the objectives of mineral intelligence, which include getting an edge in the ground game, and then developing methods of getting better valuations. You know, what should the discount rate be on this asset given its stage? I'm going to talk about some of the new technologies that we're employing to get that better insight into what's going on the ground. And then I'm going to talk about 2 of our products, DirtWork Alert and FracScape. DirtWork Alert focuses on detecting lease development and drilling plans ahead of any permit submission and getting a better probability on which permits will in fact get drilled in how long. And then FracScape focuses on real-time tracking of frac and rig crews to understand the true status and probabilities of permits and DUCs and initial production. So quickly about us, we strive to be the technology leader in geospatial energy intelligence. We spun out from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology in 2013. We're based in Houston. We've had 14 US patents granted on our novel methods for geospatial energy intelligence. We've got about 12 more pending. And what we really do is combine regulatory big data with high cadence satellite imagery and mobile phone GPS tracking and other technologies, applying artificial intelligence to that to be able to generate new kinds of insights into what's happening on the ground in the energy industry. And as one of our leading mineral investor customers has said about us, we like the edge that Sourcenergy gives us, so we're not out recommending it. And that's what I'm trying to address by coming out and presenting to you guys today. So we're gathering data from a lot of different kinds of sources, from the marketplace, regulatory data updating daily, sometimes even hourly, on oil, gas, water. We're getting into solar and wind and carbon. Subsurface geoscience models that tell us what's under the ground and what's going to come out. Other types of internet data like web scraping of legal notices from thousands of newspapers every day. And then we're gathering satellite imagery every few days, analyzing that, and gathering mobile phone tracking data every day to understand what's happening on the ground. And we turn that into a variety of different data as a service, software as a service products. Those include Sourcenergy GIS, WaterMap Pro, which for the water markets out there shows where all the water is coming from and going to between all the disposals and producing wells and frac ponds. WaterMap Geo, which shows induced seismicity risk and what's happening in the subsurface with water. And then DirtWork Alert, which detects well pads before and after drilling permits are filed and shows what's going on the ground remotely. And FracScape, which tracks the crews as they move around and allows us to analyze current statuses and probabilities of wells. Now, when we think about mineral intelligence objectives, what we hear most of the time from our mineral investor clients is really 2 main areas, and I would define these as ground game edge and better valuations. So ground game edge is pretty straightforward, right? It's being able to spot a deal ahead of your competitors so that you can get it tied up. And one of our customers, as they put it, was deal flow was sputtering and we were looking for an edge, and that's why they started using our system to get ahead of the permits that everybody else already gets. The other area of intelligence, which is kind of more interesting and more sophisticated is better valuations. And there's a lot of ways that we assist with this, but basically ensuring that you're going to make a more aggressive offer to get the deal that you should be getting, and that you make a less aggressive offer on the deal that you shouldn't be getting, or knowing when you should sell and at what price, is it a good or bad deal. And there's a few ways that we help with that and that you need to be able to make good valuations, right? One is true well status or true lease status. Can you know to the day really how many permits, how many pads, how many ducts, how much initial production is really on that lease right now or about to come onto that lease, rather than waiting for some guy on the ground to tell you, or using regulatory data that sometimes is months or even years out of date. The other element is better cash flow predictions based on a better understanding of operator patterns. So when you're getting near real-time data on what's happening on the ground everywhere, you can make better probabilistic predictions about what's going to happen on any given lease for any given operator. A real easy example of that, for example, is a lot of permits never get drilled, right? But if you can see that somebody spent $200,000 on building a well pad under that permit, now you can be pretty sure that they're planning to drill that permit. That means you can offer more money for that deal, right? Now you can offer a lower discount rate because there's more certainty of when the initial production is going to happen. And actually, the quote there from the customer on there is helpful. One of our customers said, again, I'm not making this up, real quotes, "We were in direct competition with another group on a large lead, and some recent pad construction in DirtWork alert convinced our board to pay more than our competitor. The pad site construction resulted in permits filed within a few months after close." That's the kind of everyday situation that our mineral investors are getting an advantage of. So when you look at conventional mineral intelligence methods, there's a few categories of that. Of course, first, there's oil and gas, word of mouth, right? You're talking to who you know, they're giving you hints, they're telling you things, you got people on the ground, you got an ear to the ground. Well, the good thing about that is talk is cheap. A lot of times it's free, although sometimes you actually are paying for it. The problem with word of mouth is, one, talk is cheap, everybody gets it. It's always got some bias to it, even if the bias is just that this guy likes you better than the next guy, but maybe it's, because somebody's trash talking their competitor, they're trying to throw you off, whatever it is, it's hard to sort out. And it's totally unscalable. I mean, there's only so many people that you're ever going to be their best friend where you're really getting the good intel first. So you can get up to a certain level based on word of mouth, but you really can't get past that level if you want to grow and be systematic. Another type of general intelligence that's used in minerals is what everybody uses in oil and gas, permits, right? Permit and production data from the Railroad Commission and from other states. Fast and it's free. The problem, of course, is everybody's got it, so there's zero edge. And also there's a lot of fundamental quality problems with regulatory data. Not just that a lot of permits never get drilled. A lot of them are missing or have wrong location coordinates on them. A lot of them have decimals where there should be commas, commas where there should be decibels, dots that are really 000s, stuff that's left blank. We've been in this for too long to really believe anything that you get on a first pass if it's coming out of a regulatory data source. So there's a lot of problems relying on it. Another is rig tracking, right? Everybody does rig tracking now. And it's good because it's timely and it's accurate, right? Certain companies have GPS trackers on a lot of the rigs that are out there. Of course, the problem with rigs today is, one, everybody's got it, no edge. And two, in the unconventional era, where more than 90% of new production comes from unconventional horizontal wells, knowing where the rigs are just doesn't tell you very much anymore, right? Initial production doesn't come from drilling the well. It comes from the completion. It comes from the frack. So knowing where the rigs are 10 years ago gave you a pretty good, 12 years ago, gave you a pretty good idea of where production was starting. Today, knowing where the rig is just tells you where there's going to be a duck. It doesn't tell you when or even if there's going to be initial production, right? A lot of ducks die. So rigs are not enough anymore the way that they used to be. And then, of course, there's courthouse records. And it's great to know who's leasing where, and that tells you that something's going that way, and maybe on a PV50 deal or something. But it tells you very little about when and if that lease is going to be drilled and held. And also there's a lot of errors and kind of wrong stuff that's real messy in the courthouse records if you really dig into them. And so, big picture, talking to our customers, a lot of people believe that historically you could make up for a lot of those problems with intelligence, the traditional intelligence methods, because you've got a lot of experience in the space, you kind of know where to rely on things. But the truth is, post-COVID, all of these patterns have been disrupted. Basically, everything's new. And so how do you rebuild your mental models with new intelligence and new information when everything's been disrupted in the last year and a half? What we've done is we've taken in a lot of new technologies that have only become available in the last 5, even last 3 years, to gain a new method of insight into what's happening on the ground in energy. So the first of these key technologies is cloud computing. And probably everyone here at this point has some kind of AWS account or Google account or Microsoft account where you're using something in the cloud. But the reality is with Moore's law, being able to store and process truly crazy petabytes worth of data like what we're doing has only been possible for the ordinary everyday company, a little guy like us or like most of the people out here, really in the last not even 10 years. And Moore's law keeps continuing where everything gets twice as good and half as cheap every year. And we've been able to take advantage of that to store and process amounts of data, things like the locations of every cell phone in the United States every 10 seconds. Can you imagine how much data that is? It's only been very, very recent that there was even the possibility of storing that much data anywhere, much less being able to afford to rent that space and even process that information. Another big area of technology advance that we're taking advantage of is what you might broadly call remote sensing, being able to know what's going on from far away at a low cost. So one area of that is distributed sensors or Internet of Things, right? All kinds of cheap sensors out there giving you some information from the field without having to pay a guy to drive out there in his white Ford and inspect it. Then there's also satellite imagery, and there's different kinds of satellite imagery. The number of satellites in orbit that are accessible to us every day has tripled in the past 5 years. Tripled in the last 5 years, the number of satellites that are in orbit around the Earth. And almost all of those satellites have some kind of camera on them. And a lot of those cameras are accessible to us at some price. And so we're able to see things happening on the ground with a frequency, with a cadence, and with a level of detail that was never possible before unless you just employed armies of guys driving around with binoculars. There's also other kinds of satellite imagery, like not just optical, there's something called synthetic aperture radar. This is a type of satellite imagery that cuts through clouds and bounces off of metal, which turns out to be really useful for spotting certain kinds of activity in the oil field. A third new type of remote sensing technology is mobile location data. Everybody's smartphone, every single one of them, is now tracked and reporting your location every few seconds. And that information is anonymized and aggregated to be able to understand things happening on the ground, very often in retail industries. Things like if you're planning the next Starbucks, which side of the street should you put it on? Should you put it here? How many people are walking past? How many people are driving past? Traffic counts. Those of you who have been in real estate investment know the value of that kind of thing. We've been applying that to the oil and gas industry to understand where oil and gas facilities should go and where crews are moving around and who they're working for. And then none of this, you've got all this incredible amount of data and the ability to process it from all these new sources. But no human is smart enough to be able to understand what's happening in those amounts of data. And that's where machine learning and artificial intelligence come into play, because the advances in artificial intelligence in the last 5-6 years, particularly with new methods like convolutional neural nets, have made it possible for computers to be better at identifying objects in pictures than people are. The computer will be right more often picking out, is that a dog or a cat, than the person is when you're clicking on the thing and you can't get the dang thing to go through to log into your stupid account because it keeps asking, is it a dog or a cat, and you're getting it wrong. Or is this a bridge, or is this an airplane, or click on all the stoplights. What they're doing, by the way, when you're clicking on all those things, they're getting free service from you training their machine learning models on what a dog is, what a cat is, what a plane is, what a bridge is, what a traffic light is. That's actually what they're doing with those things. So because of all that free training that you've been giving to all those companies, that's partly why the computers are now better at picking out the things in the pictures than the people are. So by putting all this together, we're able to see and understand what's happening on the ground in near real time better than we or anybody have been able to do even just a few years ago. And where we took that was we started applying these new technologies to the oil field, to satellite imagery that looks exactly like this. And actually, the story of how we got there, keeping it real short, but as you know, up until today, the company was called SourceWater, and we're in the business of finding and understanding information about water in the oil field. And probably 5 years ago, we realized that people with frac pits on their property, with frac ponds, they were really excited for us to help them sell their water to oil and gas companies. And so we started trying to figure out, how do we find all the frac ponds? And it turns out there are no government records of where the frac ponds are. But we had to find them to get that water into our water marketplace. And so we started analyzing satellite imagery like this to see, can we find the frac ponds, the squares of water in the desert, from space and associate them with land and mineral ownership records? And we could. And so we started deriving a new type of intelligence. But we also realized while we were doing that, looking at pictures like this, that there's a lot of other interesting stuff happening on the ground in the oil field that no one is detecting and reporting right now because it's not in the regulatory data, like frac ponds, like well pads, like lease roads. Or it's reported so late that there's nothing useful you can do with it, like frac crews and completions, which aren't reported for 6 to 12 months after the frac actually happens. We can see them moving around in the satellite imagery. So we started building machine learning systems to detect frac pits and well pads from space. And giving away the punchline, by applying methods like convolutional neural nets and machine learning and AI, we were able to reliably detect frac ponds and well pads and lease roads and some other things. And maybe more importantly, we were able to remove 90% of the stuff that isn't what we're trying to detect. Because there's a lot of stuff in places like the Permian that looks like a well pad that isn't, or looks like a frac pond but isn't. And we turned this into a product called DirtWork Alert, where we show you the drilling plans of operators where they're getting ready to drill, where they're starting lease development, often even before any drilling permit gets filed, and certainly before a rig gets there. So this leads to the mineral intelligence objective of getting an edge in the ground game. And we did a bunch of statistical analysis on this last year, and again very recently, to understand what's been happening during COVID. And there were some really interesting takeaways. What we did was we ran a study on every single well spudded in the Permian Basin in 2018 and 2019. It was about 13,000 wells. And for every single one of them, we looked at when did the well pad show up and when did the drilling permit get submitted and approved. What we found was, in 2018, 2019, well pads were built in advance of any drilling permit approval about 1/3 of the time. And for about 1/3 of spuds, a well pad was built before a drilling permit was approved. We also found, and in some ways this was more interesting, that about 20% of drilling permits in Texas are never drilled. In New Mexico, 50% of drilling permits are never drilled. So if you're in a business where you're trying to understand what's going to happen on a lease based on drilling permits, or assign resources to chase deals based on drilling permits, you're wasting a lot of your resources if you're just chasing permits, because a lot of them either never get drilled or don't get drilled for a long time. Another important aspect is, and this will seem intuitive when I say it, a drilling permit that gets a well pad is a lot more likely to get drilled and sooner than a drilling permit that doesn't have a well pad. Now, obviously, you can't drill a well without both a permit and a pad. But historically, people just look at permits and essentially assume that there's some probability that the permit will get drilled. Well, if you can also see the well pad, that probability goes way up, and you're a lot more likely to be right. In fact, in New Mexico, it goes up by over 50%. They also get drilled a lot sooner. So if you care about when your cash flow is going to start, knowing when the pad shows up is very important for understanding how soon the well will get drilled, when initial production will be, and when your cash flow will start. Now here we see aggregated early indicators of things that we gather going back to the beginning of 2020. And here you see a lot of the importance of being able to detect well pads in advance of drilling permits. And I know there's a lot of lines there and they're hard to see, but there's a few that matter. The gray one that shoots up toward the end there as we get into summer of 2021, that's well pads being detected, or essentially construction activity on leases being detected over the course of the last year and a half. And you can see that that's a leading indicator for new drilling starting up. And then people stop building well pads when they know that they're not going to file permits. So it's also a leading indicator of when market activity slows down. The line right under that, that dark green line, that's actually frac pond detections. Frac pond detections turn out to be 80% correlated with new completions. Again, that just makes sense, right? You can't frac a well without filling up the pond. But it takes a few weeks to build and fill up a pond, and that happens before the frac crew gets out there. I mean, if they're smart, right? If they don't want a lot of NPT. So detecting the frac ponds actually predicts when and where the completions are going to occur. And then the light blue line that's under that, that's the drilling permits. And you can see from those movements on the drilling permits that they are a lagging indicator on the well pads. Now, we also updated our analysis to look quarterly at the last 2.5, 3 years. And what you can see is, and this stat is slightly different from the one I showed earlier because it's measuring different things. But basically, more or less 25% of the time, a well pad is detected before the very first date of submission, not approval, before the first date of submission of a drilling permit for that well pad. So about a quarter of the deals out there you are going to see first if you're looking at well pads and not just permits. And here's an example of that, just so you can understand what we're talking about. So here's an XTO pad site, and this is an example of a case where a pad showed up before the first submission of the drilling permit. And in this case, we're looking at 2 pads. The pad was detected as finished on July 21st of this summer, and the permit submission went in on the 23rd or 25th, 24th or 25th. It takes a few days between when it's submitted and when you can actually get it from the Railroad Commission, so there's a spread there. And here's how we're tracking the sites as it goes along. There's no pads at the beginning of that month. The pads start getting built in the satellite imagery. And now as they get to a certain level of completeness and they really look like a pad, our system, which has been tracking them all along, says, check, we're 90% sure that's a pad, or we're 50% sure that's a pad, whatever threshold we set. What that looks like in the platform is we're automatically identifying everything that looks like a new pad every few days across the entire Permian. When we see one, we zoom in, and what we let our user do is use a feature called Time Machine to grab that area, whatever the area is. And by the way, this works for the entire North America, not just the Permian. And you pick that area, you draw a little box around it, and it instantly generates a movie, really a slideshow, going back a couple years of what was happening on that site every few days, going back the 18 or 24 months, however long back you want to reach. And that lets you decide with your own eyes, what was it happening there, and is this something that I want to make a bet on? Is that really a pad? Am I seeing the pond? Am I seeing a rig move onto the site? Am I seeing the rights of way for the pipelines being connected? And we even have a layer that's kind of cool where you can switch on that just highlights the water. So where you're seeing this green here and the bright blue is water. And so what that calls out to you is, oh look, there's a reserve pit getting built on the pad. That tells me the rig is on the way, right? That gets me ahead of the rig. Or I see the frac pond getting built. That tells me that the frac crew is on the way, but not there yet. And it highlights that feature. And by the way, some of you, poor saps, are still using Google Earth to look at satellite imagery. Here's Google Earth fully 2 months later. There's nothing there. Google Earth's imagery tends to be anywhere from 6 months to 36 months out of date. That's why it's free. They're using old archival imagery. If you want that level of imagery in the present day, it literally costs you millions and millions of dollars a year, which is a lot more than we charge. So not too many people are paying for that. Now, the second part here of better mineral intelligence is better valuations, right? What should the discount rate be for this asset based on its current status and what we know about the probabilities and what the operator's going to do? And there's 2 elements to that. Knowing the true status of the well development on any given asset remotely without having to send a guy there and look for themselves, because a lot of times that stuff doesn't get reported, and being able to make better predictions based on the status of those wells and who the operator is for what is the normal range of time until each of the next stages and normal probabilities of each of the next stages up to the initial production. And some of the questions that we get asked from clients that feed into this are, some permits never get drilled, but a pad is a real commitment, especially in places like Appalachia where a pad can actually cost $2 million, not $200,000. How many wells are going to go on that pad? Well, that might depend on the size of the pad, and in fact, it does, and we can tell you that. How long does that operator usually take to get from pad to permit to rig to frac? Because that tells me my cash flow timings. When do we take a duck off the buy list because it's a dead duck? We have ways to tell you that. If we'd known these wells were completed, we would have bought them. That's another comment we got. Because in many areas, the completion, pretty much the whole country, the actual completion of a well that triggers the initial production often isn't reported until 6 or 12 or 15 months after it happened. And you'd probably make a very different offer for that lease if you knew there was PDP there than if there isn't. So Permits and pads predict drilling better than permits alone. Again, when I say that, sounds obvious, and yet the entire industry relies on permits without looking at pads. We ran an analysis of every well drilled from 2017 up through the end of 2019. And essentially what we found is that when you combine drilling permits in an area with well pads in an area, you get a much, much stronger prediction of the amount of drilling that is going to occur in that area than if you use either one of them by themselves. Although in one case, actually using pads alone turned out to get the better results, much higher. And that's what this is showing. You're at 74, 75% when you combine the two, compared to 46% only using permits, or a range from about 20 to 38% when you're only using pads. So when you add in pads to the permit data, you get a much better prediction of what's gonna happen in that area and in that lease. This is another analysis, similar but a different type of analysis, looking at Texas Permian versus New Mexico Permian. And what you can see is that when you put permits and pads together, they predict spuds much better than when you're looking at permits alone, particularly in New Mexico. But it greatly increases your chances of making a bet that is going to result in actual production and cash flow when you add in the pads. Also, permits with pads are drilled much sooner. In fact, on median, in about half as much time. This analysis goes back the last 3 years, quarter by quarter. But rounding, there's some variation there. But essentially, when a permit gets a pad, on median, that well is going to get drilled in about half the time compared to a permit that got filed but doesn't yet have the pad. So it's much better for predicting cash flow. And then one more thing that literally no one actually in the world has seen before is this analysis you're seeing right here, which is pad sizes are strongly correlated at almost 80% with the number of wells that will be drilled on the pad. So it is very highly predictive of your potential future cash flow if you know the size of the well pad, not just the number of permits that are on the pad. Now, the last stage of what I'm going to tell you about here is about predicting and detecting completions. Because as I mentioned earlier, over 90% of new wells in the US now are unconventionals, not conventionals. And so you really don't know hardly anything about when initial production is going to occur unless you're also tracking completions, not just the drilling rigs. And today, no one does that, right? They rely on FracFocus, which is a voluntary reporting database that is usually anywhere from 3 to 12 months delayed from the reality of when completions occurred on the ground and has a lot of errors in it. So we knew that all fracs need a duct, they need a pond, they need proppant, they need a frac crew. And what we did was put a disparate set of data sources together, and we have 10 US patents granted on this, and about a dozen more coming, where we combine satellite optical imagery, synthetic aperture radar, anonymous aggregated cell phone data, regulatory data, and artificial intelligence to basically see the crews as they gather on a pad, see the equipment as they gather on the pad, and be able to associate that crew with the type of work they're doing and who they do it for. So we're able to tell you which company has people on that pad within a few days of them going out there and what type of work they're doing. And that tells us real current DUC statuses as opposed to where the DUCs were 6 months ago. It tells you which DUCs are gone, which DUCs may be dead. It tells you which companies are working for whom, and it tells you where initial production is starting, potentially a year before that gets reported by regulatory sources. It also tells you the operator patterns for any given operator in any given area of interest. What is the time and probability that they go from pad to permit to rig to DUC to frac to production? And we can tell you that for real, adjusted within a few days, not years after the fact for what they were doing before COVID. None of that stuff's worth anything anymore. The last thing I'll show you is the next thing we're coming out with, and we've already proven this internally, but we haven't released the product. We're actually able to track the individual truckloads of sand, water, and crude oil as they come and go from the well pads, come and go from the tank batteries, and go to the midstream terminals and the disposals. And this is real. What you're seeing here was we picked a random day and ran that for a few of the sand mines. So think about what it means to know when and how much sand is showing up at any given well pad for any given operator in a region. That tells you that they're getting ready to frac before they go out there, but also the amount of proppant used in a frac is very highly correlated to the amount of production that comes out of that well. So if we can give you a proportionate estimate of how much proppant is on that site before they frac the well, we can give you a pretty good estimate of what the future production is going to be 15, 18 months before it gets reported by the Railroad Commission. Think about how that would affect the types of offers that you're making and how you're valuing a lease. We also tell you when the water starts flowing and going to the disposal. Well, that tells you that initial production has really started a long time before that gets reported. And we're telling you where the crude oil is going and how many truckloads of it, if it's going in truck. And so with that, we talked about the benefits of DirtWork Alert and FracScape for mineral investors. We talked about how there's a ground game edge. The earliest indicators of development come from satellite imagery like pads. We're able to improve on regulatory indicators by combining the regulatory data like permits with non-regulatory data like well pads, frac ponds, reserve pits, completion crew movements. And you're able to verify all those observations yourself remotely using Time Machine. So you're not just trusting our machine. Our machine is telling you where to look out of the 200,000 square kilometer Permian Basin, but you're able to verify for yourself, is there right of way there? Do I see the pipeline getting built? Do I see the pond myself? Okay, I'm gonna make a bet on this. It also leads to better valuations. What's the discount rate for this asset? By seeing accurate well status at every stage, not just relying on secondhand or what comes in 12 months later from FracScape, FracFocus, you get the real well stage timings by operator, and you're able to make much better predictions of when initial production is going to start and how much production there's going to be. And again, as one of our customers said, who I don't think is in the room today, but we like the edge Sourcenergy gives us over our competitors, so we're not out recommending it. So you heard it from me. Pay attention to who I'm talking to when we're out there in the networking sessions, and maybe that'll give you a clue about it. But I urge you to try to find and talk to our current customers and see what it does for them. And don't believe them if they don't say it. Thank you very much. And if we have time for any questions, I'd love to take them. We'll be here all day.